Shabbat Shalom. Shabbat Shalom. It's great to be together here with Michael. Michael and Joy have been members of BJ since Michael retired from the SAJ, and it's really an honor to have you both here as part of our community. I met Michael before I met Michael because in the mid-70s I was profoundly impacted by the Jewish catalog. And I was a student in Montreal. I had bought this book. I was really just very challenged and opened so many things for me. I had grown up in part in an Orthodox synagogue, part in a conservative synagogue with my teacher, Rabbi Marshall Meyer in Argentina. It was still a synagogue. So after reading this, went back to Argentina and I started Chavurah, Tali and I started Chavurah in 1979, and it was really through the influence of this book, and also credit to Rabbi Ron Hagen, who was a rabbi in Montreal in the Reconstructionist Synagogue, which I attended for the years I was there. He was a wonderful rabbi, Zichrono Livracha, which was very much in the spirit of what the Jewish catalog was about. And then fast forward a number of years, I came to the seminary in 1982, and there was a guy in the library who was writing away every single day. He had these yellow papers, it was writing away. And one day, I would see him day after day in the library, the old library. Who is this guy? Michael Strassfeld. Wow, it was like, whoa. And I never spoke with him, but then I saw him at Minyan Me'at one day. You had left Minyan Me'at. You were not. And Anshe Chesed in Minyan Me'at, and he was invited to lead the service. And he started by saying, I think we should deconstruct the structure of the service, and we should begin with the Shema. And people did not like it, to say the least. And I always had, tremendous respect. Then we came to know each other and spent, we went on rabbinic retreats together, we studied together and so on. We've been Chevruta for quite a number of years now. I think, like almost close to 20 years we've been studying together, more or less weekly, with interruptions here and there, but it's been just an incredible journey together as friends and colleagues, and learning a lot. We've learned a lot, and so I've known about this book in the making and the previous version of this book for quite a number of years, and I really commend you on this achievement and this new book, and I'm happy to have the opportunity to explore what's in this book together with you. But first you're gonna, and Judith has been also in relationship with Michael for many, many years, and we'll ask you some questions, but basically we want to know what's in this book and what you suggest. What's the next disruption that you are proposing. So we'll let you teach. You want to say anything, Judith, to begin, or? Okay, so.
Now they're leaving me up here by myself. Yeah. Is this on? Oh no, it's on. Yeah, no, I just didn't know if I had to do something. Right? So, thank you, Roly. I didn't know some of those. I don't remember that moment at Minyan Me'at, but it sounds right. That moment at Minyan Me'at, but it's they also remember. So I just want to say basically a sentence about the book, and then I thought we'd start with this teaching, and then we'll continue with a conversation of the three of us, and then invite you to join in with questions in the conversation. Excuse me. Say someone asked me, okay, just tell me what the book's about. Standing on one foot, and I said that what I've come to believe is that Judaism isn't about being a good Jew. Judaism is about taking the most precious, which is our lives, and living them with the wisdom and the practice, of Judaism, helping us to live those lives fully with meaning and purpose. And so, in the process of trying to both discover that and figure out what that would mean, I came across the text that you have in front of you. It's a text of the Sfat Emet. You should be looking at the side with a lot of text, not the other side. We might get to that or not, we'll see, at the end. So the Sfat Emet is a Hasidic master. He lived mostly in the 19th century, right up. He was in a little town, Ger or Gur, that was outside of Warsaw. And he's become very popular for people who are interested in Chassidut, outside of the Orthodox community. People people who like to study him. And he wrote extensively, and as most of the Hasidic masters, he wrote on the Torah portion, or it's at least loosely connected to the Torah portion. And I actually shortened this. He begins with something from the Torah portion, but it really wasn't relevant to the main thing, so I cut it out. And I was, as I said, I was very struck with it. And I thought of asking, or maybe I'll do this. I thought if I asked you to say what you think Torah is, 2 words, not a whole sentence, just quickly, it's like you probably have these things where you throw out words on the board, and the word that gets 10 is in really big font, and then you have this, collage of words. We're not doing that part. So just anybody, just what comes to mind. We said, what's Torah? How would you define it in a word? This isn't a test. No one's going to, what? You think it's like, yes? Anybody, come on. Yes, please. Awareness. Well, guidance for a good life. Stories. Couldn't. Wait, I saw a hand over there. Teaching. Any other hands? Good. Learning how to make choices. Reminder. So, those are all good answers. So the Sfat Emet, as we'll see, says Torah is all about one thing. It's about freedom. It's about freedom. And when I came across that, I said, freedom? Yeah. I mean, no one said that. Reflection of this group, but I would guess a lot of times you get obligation, law, custom, mitzvot, etc. So let's see what he says. Okay, so I'm going to read the English, but feel free to, follow in the Hebrew if you like. The purpose of all the commandments, both positive and negative, that were given to Israel is so that every person of Israel be free. That is why the liberation from Egypt comes first before the giving of the Torah. Exodus, and then you come to Sinai. Torah then teaches the soul how to maintain its freedom by not becoming attached to material things. And the Hebrew is exactly that. Shelo lehit kasher begashmiut. Gashmiut is a modern word Hebrew word for material things, right? These are 613 counsels, right? So he takes the 613 mitzvot, commandments, and say that really eitzot, or he uses it in Aramaic, or counsels, their advice of how to do this. Every mitzvah in which the liberation from Egypt is mentioned is to tell us yet again that by means of this mitzvah, one may cling to freedom. So it's true of all the commandments, all the 613, but the ones that refer, that say, oh, and you should do this because God took you out of the land of Egypt, or you were strangers in the land of Egypt, though all those are particularly about this being free. So in the commandments, I think I'm there. In the commandments regarding the gifts to the poor, of leftover gleanings, the corners of the field, forgotten sheaves, right? So you weren't supposed to harvest the corner of your fields, et cetera, and these were left for people who were in need to come. And the Torah says, remember that you were a slave, and this way your food will have no waste, and you will not become overly attached to wealth. That is why the Torah commanded such things as tithes and gifts to the poor. These guard one from over-attachment to wealth. And I don't know if it strikes you, but for me, it feels this is a very contemporary-sounding teaching about not being attached, right? It sounds kind of Buddhist or contemporary spirituality. Don't become attached to material things. Don't become caught in distracting thoughts or anxiety or worry, right? Those things keep you back. Those things keep you from being free, being fully who you could be. A Jew has to be free in soul, all he or she has. That's why with regard to dwellings, we have the mezuzah, so he plays this out over everything. For clothes, the tzitzit, the fringe, all of this is to help us to be free in memory of the exodus from Egypt. And the fringes make for freedom with regard to clothes. This is the purpose of the entire Torah. V'zeh klal kol. That is why they read engraved charut on the tablets. The rabbis read it as they play on the word charut, which is engraved. They want to read it cherut, right? Freedom on the tablets. The only free person they added is the one who is engaged in Torah, right? The only free person is the one who is engaged in Torah. For Torah teaches a person the way of freedom. So this became basically the starting text of the book. It doesn't, there's a number of chapters first, but when I finally come to the beginning, it's talking about, kind of where are we, where have we been, the context of rabbinic Judaism and some of the problems I feel with the paradigms of rabbinic Judaism, and then I have a chapter called What is Judaism Disrupted? And the answer is this text. And then at the end of that chapter, I set forth 11 core principles of that I think this Judaism for the 21st century is about, and that's the frame of the book. So having given you that idea, some introduction, let me stop, back up Roly and Judith, and begin the conversation.
Actually, I'd like to jump in right away with this concept of freedom, Michael, because I find it really interesting and also puzzling in a sense. In this culture, we use freedom to mean freedom from constraint. I don't have to wear a mask if I don't want to wear a mask. Or freedom to do whatever I want to do. And that's so clearly what's not meant here. The one who's truly free spends all their time studying Torah. Well, in what sense is that freedom. I'm not disagreeing. I just find it really interesting and thought-provoking.
Right, that's why it's like, what, freedom? Like,
Right.
I think that's, I mean, certainly, particularly in the American context, freedom is often about, I should be free to do whatever I want. And I want the government, to be, the least possible, libertarian, et cetera. I think this is a different view, which is, I think it's saying there is both freedom from and there's freedom to, right? Actually, in Roosevelt's 4 freedoms, 2 of them are freedom from and 2 of them are freedom to. And people forget that it's both things. And I think what the Sfat Emet is really saying is it's hard to do the freedom to if you feel constrained, if in all sorts of ways, right? Either you're just lost in anxiety or depression, or you feel there's nothing I can do is going to make a difference, or anything else, right? So it's, and I think for us, particularly living in this time, not clearly for everybody, but I think for many of us, I mean, in centuries past, basically you were worried about, like, how are you going to have food for tomorrow, right? And that was most people's experience. It's still probably most people's experience, but not so much the people in the room and that we know. And so it's really the internal landscape that is keeping us back, that is not letting us reach our full potential. And so that's what the freedom is about. It's to say, no, you can do this. The Sfat Emet has another teaching where he says, every day the world is renewed, quoting the liturgy that says that God renews the world. And he says, every person is renewed each day. So what you did yesterday isn't stopping you from being really a different person today. And there is that possibility to really be different and to really change yourself and therefore change your impact on the world. It's an optimistic view, of course, but I think it's powerfully encouraging.
So what's the freedom to? To what? I mean, in his world, what was he advocating? One should be, so one should detach oneself from material concerns and worries and so on, for the sake of what in your world and your vision,
Right.
What's the purpose of the freedom to attain what?
Right. I'm not 100% sure what, if he was here, what he would say. I mean, it's interesting about the material thing because there's a fine line between saying, oh, material, that's, the spiritual is what we want, and what we want to stay away from is material. But the truth is, most earlier Jewish mysticism had that attitude, that it said that the material world is a trap, and those in Christian monasticism, it's the same kind of thing. Like, don't get involved with that. You want to be spiritual as possible. Hasidism, for most of the Hasidic teachers, as you know, it was one of the places they changed from the earlier mysticism was embracing the world and seeing the material as avenues to the spiritual, rather than the things that are in the way, the things that are traps, but that any moment, and this is an important principle in the book, so part of what I would say, the free is to say that any interaction in the world, any moment, has the potential to be a moment of holiness, to be a moment of caring and compassion. It's not, that's what I'm saying about Judaism, it's not Like only if you're davening, the moment you're davening, or you're celebrating Shabbat, doing Jewish ritual, or what I call the Jewishly Jewish things that only Jews do, right? Only those things are holy. Only those things have Kedusha. Hasidism fundamentally believed anything has the possibility to be holy. And so it's a very different way of being in the world and thinking about the world. So in some ways, even as it's saying don't get stuck, it's also saying, be in the world. It's not exactly how Hasidim live today, but that's another story, right? So that's a piece of it. I would say, for me, it's someone said awareness as the Torah. I think so. I think it's living a life of awareness, of you could say awareness of God, or an awareness of there's something larger than myself in the world. It's an awareness of, I'm not so great about being generous, or I get angry too easily, and I want to have a practice that's going to help me move away from that, right? So life is full of these opportunities to live either a life where you're basically sleepwalking through life, and then one day you wake up and say, oh God, like how did I get this old now? Not much time left, right? Or you can see each day, each moment as a possibility to be aware, to be compassionate, to work on your inner qualities.
Now, sometimes I've heard you speak and refer to certain practices in Judaism that you feel are obsolete. That you were just saying, the Jewish things that we do, or the Jewishly things. And I know that you've wrestled a lot with Jewish practice and things that you feel are meaningless or too onerous or too repetitive or not repetitive.
It could be repetitive.
Nonetheless, you're not advocating in your book a Judaism that is disruptive in the sense that it doesn't have a practice.
No.
Can you talk a little bit about that? Which practices you feel need to be let go? Which practices need to be reconfigured, refashioned? Which practices need to be retained, and so on? Because you used the word practice before.
Right. No, I think the word practice is critical, because if you don't think, halakha is law, which I don't, then what's the motivation? Is it just, I feel like it, so this week I'm doing Shabbat, next week, not so much. So what? And I admit there's something lost when you don't feel obligated, but I just don't feel, for me, that's not the reality. I don't believe it's law. I don't believe God is a commander, and God's going to punish me if I do this. I eat a cheeseburger, I don't eat the cheeseburger, So I'm using practice in its contemporary meaning, which is something you do on a regular basis. It's all self-motivated, but you do it because you want to do it. And you could compare it to like going to the gym, right? So if you go to the gym 3 times a year, or if you go to services 3 times a year, you're not going to get much benefit from either of those things, right? But I don't want to say this is about self-benefit. There's enough narcissism in our world as it is, but it's to make a commitment to something that you think is going to be helpful. Like, I want to deal with, my anger. I want to deal with it. So a practice I suggest is, many of us have a mezuzah on our door, at least on our front door, if not. And there's a traditional practice to kiss it, kind of thing. And you probably have seen people who, walk through the room, let's go walk, right? And some of that's the challenge of ritual, which is the more you do it, the less you're conscious of it, and it sort of becomes like wallpaper. You just don't think about it. So I suggest, in a number of ways, I suggest, like, wouldn't it be good to have a practice in the morning that you could do that's you could do in 5-10 minutes, not half an hour speed reading shacharit, the morning service, that would set a spiritual intention for the day. And it could be whatever. So what if when you left your house in the morning, whether you kissed the mezuzah or you just paused at the mezuzah, and you said, I'm taking this moment, as I'm taking, my keys, my phone, and a spiritual intention for the day. And I want that to orient my day. And then when I come home at night, I want to take that same moment and wipe off the dust and the distress of whatever happened during that day as I walk back into my space, right? And so it becomes a moment of paying attention, which actually, the mezuzah was supposed to be. But I think part of the problem is that a lot of the rituals have been disconnected from what they were supposed to be about, and these rituals that we do, or mostly we don't do, right? So some of it is to connect back the intention. And so similarly, I suggest like a half a dozen practices that you could do in the morning, including saying the Moda Ani, which is a traditional practice, which is one line. So again, it's not a time problem. But I suggest a bunch of other ones, some in English, or I suggest one like a social justice kavanah that you want to say every morning, that you want it to, because that's an important value for you, and you want to take that value with you during the day. It doesn't mean you're not going to forget about it in the day, but that's the point of kavanah and intention, right? And if the more you live a life shaped by those things, I think the more it will be closer to the ideals and the way you want to be, and the way you'll have positive impact on the world. So I think fundamentally to take Jewish rituals and transform them into awareness practices. And some of this is also figure out, well, how is this going to be effective, right? I could say everybody should daven 3 times a day, but most people aren't going to do that, right? So some of it's what's doable, and some of it helps you keep. I think if you do the mezuzah thing once a day each, you could do it, and it would have that sense of, okay, this is a practice, and where if I said every time you go out of the room, you should do it, like nobody could do that, right? Nobody can do it.
I very much agree with you, Michael, about using ritual and thinking of ritual as awareness practices. I find that very powerful. But as I'm listening to you, I'm wondering about the role of individual choice here and communal practice and connection. So, I have a morning awareness practice, probably maybe overlaps with yours or other people in the room, but it's not what brings us together in community. And there are places in the book that are, where you're most disruptive, where you're suggesting we need to end certain communal practices like a 2.5-hour or 3-hour long Shabbat morning service, in a language.
4 hours. It should be 4 hours.
In a language that most people don't understand, using with a concept of God that most of us no longer subscribe to. So you're talking about disrupting certain major communal practices.
We didn't see you in shul this morning.
That's because we were both at Michael's.
As a matter of fact, I quoted this text that you put here in the back of your.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah.
But we were both at the non-minion, which is a substitute, right,
Right.
for a 3-hour service. So, you know.
How long is that?
An hour and a half. So let me take, you know, I was a little hesitant, you know, with my friend Roly here to say, actually, this major thing you're doing. So it's okay. I think that's, I use the example in the sense of this is a disruptive moment. So I use the example, this is a favorite thing of rabbis and teachers, right, to go back to the time of the destruction of the temple as a similar moment, and it's really the shift from, let's call it biblical Judaism to rabbinic Judaism, and it's a major shift in practice, and you could be bet there were plenty of people who said, what do you mean that we're not having sacrifices? We want sacrifice. You can't just like say words. That's not tradition. We've always done this way, right? So I think broadly for me, rabbinic Judaism, which is the Judaism that has really carried the Jewish people for the last 2,000 years, is now facing a very different world. And I think it requires some, real shifts. And the two places I would say, briefly, is one is the rabbinic paradigm of dividing everything into dualities, right? And I think, we have discovered in our time, dualities too often lead to hierarchies, right? So men and women, well, it turns out, so rabbinic category is men, slaves, and children, right? And then there's the people not in that category, right? Women. Yeah, no. I got that wrong. So women, slaves, and children. So you realize children, at least male, in the category male, children will grow up, then they're men. Slaves can be freed, right? Women, this is an essentialism. Nothing women can do will change their status, right? And so when you have a blessing that says, thank you for not making me a woman, and you don't have the equivalent blessing, the women would say was, thank you for not making me a man, which then it would be like okay-ish, because it would be like, okay, we're just celebrating difference, right? But the fact that it's not that, clearly, and we see it other places, in regard to non-Jews, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think we are living in, and we want the world we're living in is to ever be more open, more inclusive, and not using hierarchical things. And I think that's a substantial change to the paradigms of rabbinic Judaism. I think the other place that is maybe even more challenging is the thing about services. I just, it's all the things, the length, the Hebrew, the God language, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I think it's also that, most, if I asked you, I won't do it, but I've asked you, well, what is prayer about? I think many people would say it's asking God, a basic definition of prayer is asking God for things. And I would say that most people here do not believe that God will answer yes, even sometimes, right? So what are we doing if we think that's what we're doing and we don't believe in what we're doing, right? So it's a huge challenge, because the truth is most of the people that come to services regularly, for whatever reason, are happy about it. It's not like, oh my God, I'm forced to go. I paid my dues, now I might as well get my money's worth. So it's challenging. So I don't, having been a congregational rabbi, I don't underestimate the challenge of changing what is for the mythical people who might come if we did the service differently, right? I admit that. But on the other hand, I think it's not working for most people. I think there's a sense of disconnect between whatever's in the prayer book and whatever people care about. And I think what needs to happen, I think exactly you're right, that there needs to be a communal experience. I think it's fine in the weekday mornings to do the thing yourself, because I think it's too difficult to go to the morning minyan, and that just adds another half an hour to the time I don't have in the morning, right? But I think, Jewish neighborhoods exist on Shabbat in synagogues. That's when Jews gather as Jews on a regular basis. And so we need to figure out other models or multiple models, because I think there will still be people that want the old model, to have that happen. And for me, that would be, it could be like people come and just study, because Jews really like studying. That's familiar. That doesn't feel like an unfamiliar enterprise. And not study before or study after, but there's a choice. You can go to the prayer service, or you can go to the study, and then people come together, which has its own good parts, right, because it's still community. And maybe there's a different spiritual experience. And for me, that would be more than just an hour or whatever of meditation, silent meditation, though that's another one. But it would be, this non-minyan that I've been involved with a number of years, which is trying to take pieces of the liturgy, readings, and study, and mix it together in a shorter thing on a theme, so that it's clear why we're singing these words. It's connected to the theme of the morning. And in a way, the model for me, and then I'll stop talking, is for a number of years I did a healing service with Debbie Friedman. And there was no such thing as a healing service. So we were starting from scratch. And what we did, first we were doing, it was an evening, so we tried to use Mara, the evening service. And then we said, no, let's just create a service that consisted of Debbie's music and Hasidic Nigunim, which was the thing I was bringing. And there were readings and maybe a little teaching. And they weren't about, the theme wasn't illness. The themes were like brokenness and wholeness, hope. And everybody who was at that service understood why we sang that thing, or why we just did this reading. I didn't have to get up and give a 10-minute explanation of this is why this verse is actually really interesting, because it was clear, it was connected. And they were there because either they were themselves ill, or someone they cared about was ill, or they experienced brokenness in their life, not because of illness, but just, emotional. And in that sense, it worked, in quotations. And I think that, for me, that's a model, and it's a huge challenge to actually make that happen on any, on more than, 3 places, somewhere in the world. So that was a long answer, but it deserved a long answer.
Yeah, no, thank you. So, for some, no, I want to ask you, because some of us feel a desire to connect with our ancestors, with our past, with our grandparents, great-grandparents, people that we didn't even meet, but people in the chain of our tradition that we feel somehow we want to follow in their footsteps, or to do the things that they did, even, ancient things, old things. And we want to continue some of these rituals. I understand that many of these things, have become sort of empty forms. But I wonder what how do you relate to this question of form? You know, the form, the traditional form. What you take from that, and you know, what's to be. How do you handle that?
Yeah, look, I think, I mean, that's another piece, right? There's you're right, exactly that. Things that feel like tradition have in themselves a meaning more than like, oh, I just wrote this prayer yesterday. What do you think, right? And whatever you think of it, it's still, one of the things that's hard is like, oh, like I never heard this prayer before, right? It doesn't have any traditional. I just feel that we're in disruptive times, facing lots of challenges, and that we have to try a bunch of things. And I have faith that over time, the things that will have lasting impact are the things that are worth having. You know, that's a good prayer, right? That's like something, you know, it's very hard to do this same reading every year, right? Because unless it's a really good reading, and then you're sort of like, oh, I'm looking forward to that reading on the holidays, because every year it's like, wow, you know, that's powerful. So that becomes liturgy, right? And you don't really know until you do it for a while. And you know better than many people that the truth is there's whole parts of the liturgy that have been left behind. That there was the world of piyut. I mean, there are thousands of them. You know much more about this than I do, right? And those were a creative addition to the prayer service for hundreds of years. And then it ended. And I think partly it's because one of the larger things is the world you live in, right? So the world they lived in the Middle Ages, having a 4-hour service was like, well, what else were we going to do? Go
Kiddush.
home. Go home. What?
Kiddush.
Kiddush, yeah. But go home and watch TV? I don't think so. Wait for the next pogrom so we could practice our running. So it was a different world. The sense of time was different. Now we live with a sense of time of how fast the computer operates. Never mind miles per hour. So as much as some places in the traditional Orthodox world is really into chumrot, stringencies, nobody says, you know what? There's these piyutim that you're supposed to say on these fast days, in the winter, and we're going to do those because we want the service to be longer. Nobody says that. And I'll tell you the other thing, those fast, there were lots more fast days in the Middle Ages, and nobody wants more fast days, right? Because that was a much more ascetic, anti-material world. This is a world, even in the most Orthodox place, that embraces the materiality of the world. We really want nice baby carriages for our 12 kids, right? Because it's a way to have something nice, right? And again, there's nobody who's saying, we should go back. I mean, these were fast days, not like Tisha B'Av, but in the traditional world, these were fast days that people did. And as far as I know, nobody in the Orthodox world does it today because it's just so against the modern temperament, which has affected even the most Haredi world. So there's a piece of that. Things have changed, and let me add another point here, which is I think one of the things I like to say. One of the things that I think was brilliant about rabbinic Judaism was they created a Judaism that was portable. You could take it anywhere in the world that the winds of misfortune took you, and you could have it. You didn't have to worry about the temple in Jerusalem, etc. But today, I mean, that's still useful, but today our Judaism, living in an open society, living in the world we lived in, which is a world mostly without boundaries, we need Judaism that's permeable or porous, that really lets the outside world in. And so the context of our Judaism is so different, right? And I think that leads to different kinds of practices and different ways of thinking about it. I mean, the truth is, again, in the Middle Ages, they certainly interacted with the people people who weren't Jewish that lived around them, but it was mostly commercial interaction. They lived in a culture that was completely Jewish. They didn't say, well, let's go, maybe Christmas Eve we'll go to Mass at the church, like some of us do, like nobody was doing that in the Middle Ages, right? And there were very separate worlds. We live in a very integrated world. And the truth is that world is now increasingly part of who we are, because that world includes members of our family who are not Jews, who are part of our world, right? It isn't separate worlds anymore. And so I think so what I'm saying, Roly, is I think there's large questions that need to be addressed. And I believe, as I think Rabbinic Judaism believes, that those things get transformed into rituals and practices. It's not just theoretically, it doesn't matter. It is about doing, right? And so that will lead, I think, to different ways of not just thinking about, but sort of living a Jewish life that is more open to the world around it, And so, I mean, I don't know that anybody here is worried about their wine, being kosher wine and not, there's this whole thing about what makes wine not kosher. I think you probably know is if a non-Jew pours the wine, right? It's not the ingredients. Well, that is so offensive a concept, right? It's it's barely there, and the truth is, the Jewish world broadly has not, again, the Orthodox world has dropped that area of halakha more than traditional halakha more than any other. It's so dropped that we don't even know that we've dropped it because nobody has observed it for a while. But it's we have to look at, like every other tradition, we have to look at our tradition and sort of say, look, there's some really terrible things in the Talmud, and we have to say those are terrible things. And the truth is, Jewish mysticism is actually, one of the worst violators of that, because it often says, it's often about, again, like use that word, essentialism, and so there's one strand that says, people who aren't Jewish don't have the same souls that Jews do. I mean, that is the definition of racism, right? And it's not. These are things that many of you probably are not even aware of, thankfully. But it's part of this larger piece of saying we are creating a more inclusive Judaism, and then what does that mean, right? And what does that mean about our relationship to non-Jews and their participation in Jewish lives, and how do we refer to them, right? Like I try not to say non-Jews because it feels like it's an odd way to define people. I don't know that people who are not Jewish is much better, but I haven't, anyways. But I think that context is really critical, and we'll have. I haven't figured out all the ramifications, but I think it will have serious ramifications, not just the obvious things about, what can people who aren't Jewish, what can they do in the synagogue and ritual and whatnot. But it's really a larger way of seeing who we are in the world and our relationship to the world. Yes. Long answer, but.
No, as you're speaking, Michael, I'm having an image of the synagogue as a space where multiple things can be happening simultaneously. You could have a traditional service, and you could have people studying, and you could have people, doing a short comment. You could have lots of things going on. And I vote when people say to me, feminism is going to destroy Judaism, I've always said just what you're saying, that it's not so fragile, and the things that are meaningful and speak to people will endure, and the things that don't work won't endure, and time will sort it out. We don't know what will be the Judaism of the future. I guess as someone who grew up Reform with the old Union prayer book and really was shocked when I encountered the Siddur and realized that I had grown up with small excerpts.
It was short.
Short excerpt. It was short. It was short. I was angry. I felt cheated. And so I have the question, as we change and as we pare down and as we get rid of the things that aren't working anymore, how do we maintain some awareness of them? Because future generations may not make the choices that we made. And it's like with the PU team that, we stopped saying them, and you're bringing some of them back, Roly, and we're realizing how beautiful they are and how it's sad that we didn't know them. How do we sort of drag it along without letting us drag it down?
Yeah, I don't think there's obviously any magic answer. I think, in the book I reclaim the notion of Minhag America, the custom of America, which was, Isaac Mayer Wise, leading Reform rabbi in the 19th century, when it looked like Reform Judaism was going to be the only Judaism in America, and he talked about Minhag America. And I like the phrasing because Minhag means custom. And I think we're at a time of, as I say, necessary disruption, when we should try lots and lots of things. And Minhag, makes it more flexible than to say this is the new law, right? We think instead of doing it that way, we should do it this way, right? But we say, look, we're custom. And I decided not to say, because I'm hoping that other people will write books like mine with their own versions of what a Judaism in the 21st century could be like, and then there'll be, lots of exploration and lots of trying out things. But I didn't want to call it minhagei, the customs in plural, because I think it's important for us to feel like, we're doing different things, but we're all one, and that's, and I don't need. So if Roly wants to do PUTIM and I have no interest, that's okay. I don't have to, it's not a zero-sum game, right? The people that want to do that will do it. The people that want to do the people, et cetera. There's lots of different places. And as I say, at some point, something may emerge, or it could emerge, which would be really interesting, is that there's multiple forms of Judaism, but it's not like, well, ours is better than there is too religious, there is not religious enough, there is but it's just we do things differently. And of course there'll be a challenge, it becomes a challenge to eat together, right? Or maybe to have Shabbat together. But you sort of work at that and make it work. Because, ultimately that's not the important thing. So I think, again, I think there's more that's been left behind than we realize, right? one of my sort of odd interests is superstition and magic and superstition in Judaism. That was like real stuff. We think that's like superstition, but they really believed it, right?
Judith's father wrote a major book on Jewish magic and superstition.
Oh,
Trachtenberg.
Trachtenberg,
Rabbi
yes.
Trachtenberg.
It's my
Everybody knows
favorite
it.
book. Favorite book.
Not my favorite.
So, but it was a whole, I actually had this in the book and I took it out because I just had too much of the book. So, because it's an example of a competing belief system to rabbinic Judaism that they accepted. Like now, Orthodox say, no, we can't. Oh, feminism, that's outside. That's a foreign value, so we don't pay attention to it. Yeah, but they paid attention to. They believed it. You were allowed to fast on Shabbat if you had a bad dream Friday night, and if someone came and said, you know what, we're going to do Yom HaShoah on Shabbat, and you should fast, then they would say, you can't fast on Shabbat. Only if it's Yom Kippur. That's outrageous. You can't do that. But they did it because they really believed that that bad dream had significance, right? And you took it seriously. And that was a completely outside Judaism, as it were, competing system, And now, even in Borough Park, they don't believe it anymore. They believe in science. They don't think demons make things happen. It's science that makes things happen. But all I'm saying is we shouldn't be so afraid of leaving stuff behind. And it's a challenge. Look, it's a challenge. Like, how do we read the 9th chapter of Megillat Esther? Do we just not read it? Do we read it quietly? There's plenty of stuff in the Torah. Like, do we really want to read that passage or not? And that's a tension. But I think you have to also be willing to say, you know what? We don't need to say this Orthodox community, but it's in the Conservative Prayer Book too. We don't need to pray for the Babylonian academies that haven't existed for 1,000 years on Shabbat, like for Yom Kippur. Like, why are we praying for these institutions that haven't existed? And scholars will remember them, but we don't have to remember them, right? So I think the opposite is the challenge, is how do you create a really rich Judaism that offers lots of practices to people that will say, like, I really want to do that. I find that helpful, right? I struggle with this issue, and this, or, take social justice, right? So I think within the tradition there's a variety of teachings about social justice that I'm sure some of them being in this congregation, that encourage people to cultivate a practice around social justice, and that's a good thing. And the more we can teach about that, and I could give you some examples, but what about a practice around satisfaction, right? That's like a big issue, like practice around food. So you could say Judaism has a practice around food. It has a number of practices around food, right? So you could, kashrut is a challenging practice around food, right? Because I can't explain what it is, why you can't. I could, milk and meat, it's life and death. None of those, we have no idea. That's the truth. And none of it is obviously convincing. And you have a whole bunch of other food practices, all of which make total sense, whether you do them or not. You're vegetarian, locavore, et cetera, right? Like, nobody says, vegetarian, that's weird. Like, why would you do that? You might say, I like meat, I don't want to be a vegetarian, but it's clear, right? So in the book I say, look, I think eating food is a basic part of your life. And it's challenging. For many people, this is a very difficult area. You know, and I sort of talk about, like, it starts from, you know, the Garden of Eden. They had one thing, and they couldn't do it, right? And, you know, and I noticed that it's a really interesting thing. So they eat the thing, and then they make clothes, and then God goes looking for them, and they're hiding, right? And God says, where are you? And he said, Adam says, I'm embarrassed, I was naked. He wasn't naked, he just made clothes, right? Psychologically, he was naked. It's like the first psychological moment in the Torah, right? Where actual reality and your experience of reality are not the same, right? So that's, and after that, clothes, it's all about, well, how do I look, right? And how do I look to other people, and how do I look to myself, right? So that's part of the exile, as it were, of the Garden of Eden, right? So it's all these pieces are pieces to kind of to think about, to create practice about. What's going to help me to feel like, like I'm eating this whole bag of potato chips, and and now the potato chips are gone. I don't even remember eating them, and I don't feel any better than I did before. And physically I feel worse, because I was looking to get fed by the bag of potato chips that doesn't actually do that, right? So we have these things that we think are going to help us, when we're in trouble, which don't help us or actually make things worse. So an awareness is to say, like, that's not going to help me. Like, what can help me? What can help me is to realize, like, this is an issue that I struggle with, right? So what can I do about it? Or at least I should be aware. And maybe I'll only take half the bag, right? But that's not nothing. Yeah, just take one. Yeah, that doesn't work, right? They didn't want it to work, right? And they put stuff in the food so it won't work, right? So, so it's addictive, right? So it's all the things you struggle with. And if there's wisdom in the tradition, teachings about, in the book I have a whole thing about satisfaction, including the teaching of the Gaon of Vilna about, and there's like wisdom. Doesn't mean it, I read it, now I know it, like I never have to eat those bag of potato chips again. No, of course not. But it is, again, it comes to a tradition that's going to help me live my life as best I can, and maybe free me from some of the things that really keep me chained from being the person I want to be, the negative behaviors, et cetera, et cetera.
Shall we open it up?
Yes, oh, sure.
So I'll pass a mic with your live stream.
Needs to be turned on. Needs to be turned on, though.
Huh?
There's a switch to turn it on at the bottom.
Yeah. Yeah, no.
I think this is a question, it starts kind of with a statement, though, which is that aren't all branches of Judaism just disruptions of their time anyway, whether they be conservative or reform or reconstructionist? So is there anything, do you imagine is this like are you imagining like a humanistic branch or, I guess I'm sort of asking, I feel like the challenge that you're giving us is to really think of what's important to us, and that should be relevant in whatever our Judaism is. But I'm also curious if you're thinking of, is this some sort of new movement that you'd like to create?
No, I'm not thinking of it as a new movement. It'll be this, the Strassfeld denomination. rah, rah, rah. Look, you could look at the 20th century and say either, all those denominations were successful in the 20th century, and now they're not so successful in the 21st, or maybe they weren't so successful, but we just thought they were successful. Look, I fundamentally feel that Judaism is still responding to the modernity, starting with the Enlightenment, and that it's been a number of centuries of response. And, people argue for the next 1,000 years, whatever, was this thing successful or not? I just feel we're not being successful now. And so I came up with these ideas. I think there are, some big ideas here about what's the context of Judaism, how do you think about practice and halakha. And I'm hoping actually that there'll be other people. And for me, Judaism needs to have a spiritual, religious holiness component. So humanistic Judaism doesn't work for me, but I think that's fine. In other words, I think it, and one of the biggest challenges to my kind of Judaism is people's, uncertainty about God, right? So I think that's, a big obstacle to being part of something that's religious or uses the word holiness and spirituality. Though I think we're all trying to define that broadly. So that's why I say, like, if you think of there's something larger than yourself in the universe, that doesn't necessarily have to translate to something called God, right? But I think that's, whatever happens will happen long after I'm gone, in terms of if there's a movement or, but I come again to feel, I'm actually mostly an optimistic person, but I'm feeling concerned about liberal Judaism. And yes, there are sparks of really interesting things happening, and there's, some synagogues like this one that are really flourishing, but too many places that's not true, right? It feels more like the exceptions than the rule.
Michael, thank you so much, and Judith and Roly. I have a question, because if freedom is so fundamental, how do we explain historic and even contemporary Jewish acceptance of slavery, of Jews and non-Jews, of women, and even the economic benefits that have come with Jewish involvement in the slave trade?
It's a good question, and obviously you could say that, the ideal is never the reality, right? I think, it's a hard question to answer. I think some of it is shifting from a world that, felt like the outside world wasn't our responsibility, and if anything, it was, against us, to now feeling, as I say, more a part of that world and more of the responsibility of doing it. And I think, that's what I'm saying. I think there's, whether it's attitudes towards social justice, or one of the other principles in the book is about the environment. And, I think it's to kind of really promote thinking about how to do that, and how to make it as a practice. You know, that some of the things I do about the environment, I see as a practice, and that's going to make me do them. I suggest one suggestion is that the holiday of Sukkot, I connect to the environment, which other people have done that. But I suggest, like, you could take that week and have a practice of trying to live more carbon footprint friendly that week. Not that doing that means you save the planet, but it's a statement of this is important. So maybe instead of driving to work that week, I'll take public transportation or I'll take a bike, even though I won't do that the week after, right? But that part of what I think the holidays are about is to bring a consciousness to you that you should have all the time, but you can't have all the time, right? You shouldn't be hurting people and only asking for forgiveness during high holidays, but it's useful to have a time that says, look, pay attention to this now, right? At Sukkot, pay attention to this now, and maybe some of that will carry on into the year, right? So I think it moves you towards, I would say this, and I'll think about your question more, but it moves you to more freedom. That's what I'm hoping, that if I do that at Sukkot, then I'm a little bit more free, et cetera, et cetera.
Michael, if I can jump on Ted's question for a minute, I think the reality is your book, and this is its strength, is interested in those practices that can move us forward and those things in the tradition that help us to move forward. You're not interested in the book in the things in the tradition that pull us back, even though they're equally important in our text to those things that push us forward. And I think that's just, I was reflecting on the difference between my book and your book, that I'm interested in the ways in which the tradition keeps us unfree and, undoing that. You are focusing on the positive things. And, it's not that you wouldn't acknowledge that all these other horrible things are there. They are. But that's not where you're focused.
That's great, thanks.
So I just want to pick up in part on both Judith and Roly's questions from before, and I'm not even sure whether I can state this very clearly, but I'm getting the sense from a lot of what you're saying that you are talking about making it's sort of individual, or it's going to be experienced a lot on an individual level. And Roly was talking about tradition. Judith asked the question about community. I'm just so aware in this so-called post-COVID moment, God willing, we'll be going forward, of how important community is and how important it was for so many of us that we couldn't be together, and how important it has really, it feels like every time we get together, we still are aware of how important that is. And for all of the difficulties with prayer, one of the things that prayer services do is provide a context for us to come together. I acknowledge that BJ is unusual, and I think, it works really well here in so many ways. And at the same time, I'm thinking of the criticisms that people raised of the early Chavurah movement. You do stuff that works for you, you're taking the energy out of the community, blah, blah, blah. And we said, no, if it's not going to work for us, it's not going to work. We have to do what's going to. So it's sort of a tension between individual and community, and a tension between tradition and something new. And I just.
Yeah, it's all that. And let me just answer this quickly, that I think, again, yes, but I'm saying community is really important. So in think it's the second principle. So I talk about the commandment, love your neighbor as yourself, and those commandments in Leviticus 19. Well, those are all about creating a caring society, right? If, there's no, solitary monastic tradition in Judaism. It's like if you live in a cave and you don't have to deal with people, loving your neighbor yourself is really easy, right? and gossiping, well, who are you going to tell? And what are you going to hear in your cave? So the metal heats the pedal heats, whatever. No, it's in that, right, that either you're creating, love, either fulfilling love your neighbor as yourself, and all those other kinds of, don't put a stumbling block before the blind. All those things is about creating a society and reproving people, which means, like, I actually care about. I'm not going to. You can't just say, okay, Martha said that. I'll forget it. I'll forgive her. No, like I need to try and help you to be a better person. And tradition recognizes how difficult that is, right? But there is a vision there of a community of people that really care about each other and don't gossip about each other, et cetera, et cetera. And, and it only happens when individuals engage in that, right? So I think that's essential. You can't do it just by yourself, living on the top of a mountain or on the bottom of the mountain.
Don't take gossip away from us.
I appreciate it, Rob, but the last thing I added to the book before the publisher said no more was a teaching I came across about the Sfat Emet, which I was, like, again, stunned by, which I understood as he's saying, he plays with Shabbat. If you switch the letters around, it can be Boshet, which is kind of embarrassment. And it struck me that it's about a sense of oneness on Shabbat. There's different ways. In the book, I talk about there's different ways to conceive of Shabbat, and your practice might reflect that, not just the traditional practice. So if you think it's all about oneness, then that custom of covering the challah so it won't be embarrassed because you're making kiddush for a switch. I was like, oh, come on. actually becomes interesting in that aspect of the Sfat Emet, which is don't embarrass anybody on Shabbat. And in fact, I don't mean to criticize it, if you say, like, oh, I'm going to go to shul to hear whatever the latest gossip is about that person, that is not oneness. That is actually as much a violation of Shabbat as, classic drive, whatever it is, driving your car and cooking and something. In other words, Shabbat is supposed to be a day of Shalom Bayit. That's also part of that, peace in the house, right? So it's challenging because, I just had a fight with joy, right? So, like, that doesn't feel like, but that's an incredible vision of what Shabbat could be that is powerful and is not particularly related to the traditional practices, but it's still an extraordinary notion of Shabbat, which makes sense and is under the, like, Me'ein Olam Haba, that Shabbat is supposed to be like the Messianic, it's supposed to be more perfect, a more perfect day. And what if you try to live up to that on Shabbat? What if that became your practice? So, sorry to... Robin,
Is this on? Okay. So, Michael, I love your idea of disruption. I think the hard part, there's so much hard about it, but you have an extraordinary depth of knowledge of our tradition, and how can moderns who want, freedom and openness, and if we don't have that access to these beautiful teachings, and how will we ever be able to have a meaningful disruption? I mean, it's a very tough thing. You have this vast, you're a yeshiva bacher, you have this vast, it's not fair. You were in the undisrupted Judaism, and now you have this vast knowledge that enables you to parse meaning, and that's really hard.
Robin, I told you not to make that comment because it looks like you just want people to buy the book.
But really, that's a real problem.
Well, but that's why, I appreciate that. And it's true that I have an unusual background. And what makes it more unusual is I want to take that background and create new things with it, rather than just say, like all these things we do, and here's another reason they're great and wonderful, and you should do them. No, I'm interested in, creating new things, right? So it's an unusual combination, not unique, but unusual to other people.
Michael,
but I think, I think, I don't know what this, I understand, but then, and I'm not, it's not like by the book, but it's, in other words, I'm bringing these ideas to people and trying to make them accessible to you by putting them, in a book, and in a way, I hope people will say, oh, I get that. I never thought of that oneness idea, but I kind of get it, and I don't need to know the Sfat Emet text to understand it, and I can do it, and I can think of it in my own way, and that's what I'm hoping. I discovered a bunch of things that were new to me, and I want to bring them to people because I think they're valuable teachings and exciting teachings, and can help people say, well, I just didn't make it up. I read this in this book, and it's actually, it's in some Jewish text someplace, So, don't tell me like, some other person can't tell you, well, that's not Jewish. Well, it's this guy, this Sfat Emet, I don't know who he is, but he wrote this. Like, he's like a real guy. So I understand that I'm atypical.
If we don't have the access, if people don't have the access, how are they going to be able to?
But Robin, I want.
Look, if I could give this book away under the premise that everybody would read it, promise me, I would do that because I'm really interested in getting these ideas out there. It's not, it's not to have the Michael Strassfeld Judaism. It is. I think these are really important things. Oh, I'm sorry. I think these things are really important things. And I think a lot of it is not texts that are not, I'll just mention one and then I discovered there's a third category of mitzvot, which I was stunned because I had this whole background. So there's mitzvot, commandments between you and God. There's commandments between you and other people. And that's what for 60 years, I thought that's it. So there's actually mitzvot ben adam atzmo, commandments between a person and themselves, which feels so completely contemporary, related to whether it's musar or spiritual practice. And it's actually in the tradition. And I'm sure if I went to Borough Park and talked about it, like 95% of the people there or more would never heard of it. And I think it's great to be able to say, like, oh, we didn't just, we borrowed from American Buddhism, and it's not really Jewish, and now we're doing all this stuff, to say, like, no, within our tradition, there is something that says that there's three foci, the thing that's larger than ourselves, other people, community, and me, my interior life. And it's great to have like a traditional language for that. For me, that's important. that there's some place in the tradition that lends support to this. So I would encourage you, to look for that stuff. And, people, I have a website, michaelstrassfeld.com. You can, get my email and write me questions and stuff like that. Because I really want this to be accessible to people. And the truth is, that's what my life has been about, starting from the Jewish catalog, is trying to make Judaism accessible to people. And this is the latest version on a much, that focuses on why do it, not how to do it, right? The catalog was really like, oh, you want to do this stuff? Here's how to do it. Now it's like, this is why this is so important. This is why this can really enrich your life. Here's the teaching and practices. It's not just like the Sukkot thing. So I made that up, right? Like, oh, you could, but I think it's a good idea, and people will do it or not, or find their own way of doing it. All right.
Okay, so I have a few different thoughts that I want to combine. But first, I think that you have done a great job from the Jewish catalog to the Jewish holidays of like bringing those books to people who actually have, background, I think. And you also said that you're worried about liberal Judaism. I'm also worried about liberal Judaism. So I think that one of the questions, and the third point is, this week I had a conversation with a friend of mine who's studying, whatever, he's in some Jewish Muslim group, and he was talking about how that the non-observant Muslims see the observant Muslims as, they don't put them in a hierarchy as that's better, right? Knowing more texts doesn't mean that you're better. And I feel like one of the things that's held liberal Judaism back in a big way, right, is I think most of us actually see that as better, right? Like that, I'm wondering whether the right conveyor, it's sort of in contrast to what Robin thought, which is not somebody who has tons of text knowledge. Maybe that's not the person who can bring out some of these ideas to the world, but it has to be somebody who, I guess, didn't come with that background, was a seeker and found it that way, as opposed to I found all of this and then I'm going to bring it out and translate it. And I'm wondering how you think about that, or how you even think those ideas can get out there, because I do think that, like sort of what Suzanne said, I think it's a good question whether we were successful or not successful as liberal Judaism over this period of time, but I would like it to be successful. So I guess the question I have is, how can you see greater, like almost sociological success? Like, is it the conveyor? Is it the marketing? Is it is it services for, is it some of the ideas that you've had? But I'm just actually interested in that question.
Look, it's an interesting point, and it might be that someone who, was more like the average Jew, would, then Robin wouldn't ask that question. Well, you're just like me, you know a little bit more than me, but you're doing this stuff, and wow, you can be a real model for me, rather than, oh my God, every time Michael opens his mouth, he knows stuff that I don't know, right? So I feel, he knows all this stuff. Like, how does he know all this stuff, right? So, but it would be hard for me to pretend I didn't. Look, let me end with this story which just happened to Joy and I. We were at a panel of artists, Jewish artists, talking about Judaism and art, the intersection, the gallery in Soho. And, the artists were introducing themselves, and I'll do the very short version of this. So, one person said, well, and I'm a mediocre Jew. And then the gallery owner said, well, I'm actually a bad Jew. And it was clear to me that what they meant by that was exactly what you were saying. Like, we don't know those texts. We don't know what goes on in synagogues. We don't know any of that stuff. And so, A, we don't know that stuff, or we're not that interested in that stuff, but It's a lot we don't know this stuff. And the good Jews are in synagogue, and we're not those people. And as long as many people believe that, we're in trouble. Right? So I want to say, that's what I'm saying. Being a good Jew isn't going to synagogue. You should go to synagogue, but it's, you know, it isn't going to synagogue or not eating a cheeseburger, right? It is, you know, trying to engage in a life of holiness, of meaning, of purpose, of awareness, right? And we have to change that conversation and that idea that, you know, it's a different world. That world's a different world. We don't have the passport. We're not going, right? And that's a hard thing to do, because, and you know, that challenge I felt from the beginning about the book was a variation of yours, which is, how do I reach those people, right? Not the people who maybe are involved, but you know, I don't know, somehow I feel I could get more out of this Judaism thing than I'm getting. So, oh, here's this book. Maybe I'll read it. Maybe, you know, go here and whatever. But the people who are not really looking and not seeking, and they just have this idea of what is, and it's a really bad idea. And I think we have to change the product. It's not about better advertising, right? It's not Hasbara like Israel. It's not, no, it's what's happening there. It's not like, if we only presented better, it would be okay. And I think this is the same thing. We have to have, and some of this is about feeling more welcoming, and that's why the permeable is a critical piece. You know, people don't feel welcome. People feel that you have to be members of a synagogue to attend any service in a synagogue. That if you haven't paid dues, you can't go. Smart people living on the Upper West Side, you know, not people wherever, not, you know, but, and those are, all those things. And I think ultimately it becomes, you know, I think it's about modeling. Like, you meet somebody and it's like, what? You're into this Jewish stuff? Yeah, like this is what, you know, and what are you doing? Like, oh, I have this practice, like around the environment. So before we eat, oh, I keep on forgetting to do this. I have this practice around the environment. Before we eat, we take the scraps down to, you know, what's it called? Composting. Thank you. We take the scraps down and compose it. We have that's like a ritual. So that's a ritual. You know, you say a blessing. So no, we just do it. Or no, we have this blessing. You know, this is, you know, whatever. I'm just made that up in the moment. But it's like, and then someone says, you know, I get that. Like, I like that. You know, and then it becomes a tradition that has, you know, real meaning. And people say, I want to know more about this. You know, and I want to see how people practice it. And now I'm, you know, and I'll do a little bit, you know, and then someone else will do a little bit. Last question, sorry.
Hi, Shabbat Shalom. Thank you so much for all of your work and your teaching, which for decades has contributed to this kind of important conversation. I was always taught, I have always experienced, and I've always tried to teach, that Judaism itself is a 4,000-year-old disruption. That we are, by definition, you know, an ongoing revolution, if you will, in the way that, Suzanne, you mentioned, you know, other historical developments of denominations that are themselves examples of an inherent dynamic in our tradition, you know, our ability to move from a temple-based tradition into a rabbinic tradition, into post-Enlightenment, voluntary tradition. I mean, I think there's the reason why the Torah isn't under plexiglass in the museum next to the Magna Carta is because we are blessed in being given not just the possibility but the responsibility to always be moving and changing and adapting. That's who we are. So I guess I wonder, is it Judaism that needs to be disrupted? Or is it Judaism that needs to be better harnessed in order to disrupt a generation that's filled with a certain amount of antipathy, indifference, ignorance, in order to harness its inherent resources and build a generation that is courageous as you are, to own and embrace our inherent, not just dynamic of evolution, but our inherent capacity to tolerate difference and diversity and to celebrate that. I mean, I think we're living through an era of unprecedented Jewish creativity, and I think we have so much to be proud of in that respect and so much more to do. So I guess my question is, what are the risks and benefits of saying that it's Judaism that needs to be disrupted as opposed to saying Judaism needs to better disrupt?
I think it's both. I think it's both simultaneously, right? I think Judaism is a force for disruption. It's asking us to do. It's asking us to do, more. It's suggesting we could do more, right? It's like the Sfat Emet's teaching I said earlier. Every day it's a renewal. You can do this. It's possible. It's not. You don't have to be, the Dalai Lama to live a life of spirituality. This is possible, right? I think, so that's true, but I think it's also, one of the interesting things about Hasidism is this notion that they have a more dynamic notion of Torah. So there's one teaching of the Degel Machane Ephraim, one of the Hasidic masters, that says that you have to discover what the Torah is of this generation. And the implication is that it's different, right? It's not the same Torah as before. So part of the process is both disrupt us, but also look for what is the Torah of our time, right? And that I think is the, so I think I'm saying it's both those things, and they interact, right? One feeds the other.
Okay. I think this is following up on what Sally said. Have you given any thought to the Jewish calendar and in the lens through which you're looking at things? Because the Jewish calendar is very formidable and intimidating, particularly, just short.
Well, I think, yeah. In other words, in the book, there's like subchapters about the major Jewish holidays. I didn't do Purim and Hanukkah, but I did, so I spoke about Sukkot, the fall holiday. And for me, each of those holidays asks us to, as I said earlier, to pay attention to a specific important theme. So, environment for Sukkot, Tshuva, repentance for the high holidays. Passover is freedom, right? So, one of the things that needs to be disrupted is the Passover Seder, because it's often become routine, right? So I wrote a piece, I hope to get placed someplace as an op-ed piece, which says the 4 questions were sample questions. They weren't like, have every Hebrew school kid learn this and say them, you're supposed to really ask questions. So I come up with 4, kind of new questions, because it is supposed to be, I use actually Lincoln's incredible words, supposed to be, Passover is supposed to be a new birth of freedom. That's what's supposed to happen at the Seder. And the challenge is, like, how you do that, and with kids and different people. You know, it's not, there are real challenges, but it's not supposed to be rote ritual. That's like a big thing for me. A lot of the stuff has become rote. So how do you unroticize it, to make up a bad word? You know, and right, and the same. So I think there are moments that say, hey, pay attention to this. And I think Passovers also say, hey, you know what, that food you eat all year long, bread, which is like important, staff of life, like, don't eat it this week, right? Well, that's like the weirdest thing, right? Like, now it's a bad thing the rest of the time. Like, I think it's about saying, like, pay attention to something you don't pay attention, which is food. You just eat whatever you eat. I mean, I talked about how it's complex, but in some ways it's an activity that just goes on. And Passover is saying, take a week and think about it, right? Bring your attention to this and see what happens. And so for me, that's what the holidays are about. It's not so much celebrating the Jews wandering in the desert, who certainly weren't living in Sukkot booths like we have, like, no, not historically, you know, but it's, you know, what are the themes that they're asking us to reflect? And people could create other themes, those are very rich. So that's, and if you were saying, like, well, do I have to observe the whole week? I don't know what the difficulty of the calendar, I mean, those are things that are challenging, but there's no magic answer, you know, but how you think about them can happen. You have plenty of time to think about them, however long or short the holiday is. I hope that was something about it.
So thank you so much, Judith and Michael. Yasher Koach on the book. The book will be on sale. So how did we say? It's in the next room.
Yeah,
I think we have books available for people. So I think you have to leave your name. If you don't have what to pay with, you can leave your name, and during the week you will be contacted so that you can make a payment for the book. So you can take it now and read it, and then you will be charged.
And I'm happy to sign it, and if for whatever reason, you know, it's available at Westside Judaica, it's at Amazon, Barnes & Nobles, and the publisher Ben Yehuda Press. So, and thank you for the conversation.
Thank you.
Really.
Thank you. We'll do Havdalah, those who wish to stay for a few more minutes.